Solving quadratic equations by factoring. Our objective is to solve quadratic equations by factoring. Why learn this? A high diver can use a quadratic equation to determine how many seconds he or she will be in the air. Let's start with the zero product property. If the product of two quantities equals 0, then at least one of the quantities equaled 0. Think of it this way. 3 times 0 is 0. 0 times 4 is 0. So it doesn't matter if either one of the values, A or B, ends up being 0, then the product is going to be 0. Let's practice. We're going to use the zero product property to solve each equation. So when you multiply by 0, then you're going to get a product of 0. So that means we need to set each of these equal to 0. So we have x minus 3 equals 0. When we solve for x, we end up with x equals 3. In this next one here, we have x plus 7. We need to set this equal to 0. So we have x plus 7 equals 0. So x equals negative 7. You needed to do both because if we refer back to the zero product property, at least one of the values has to be 0. So your first quantity could have been 0 or your second quantity could have been 0, and you still would have ended up with a 0 in the end. So therefore, the zeros are 3 and negative 7. Let's try this next one. So we have x. That quantity, to set it equal to 0, well, that's just going to be x equals 0. Now let's try this second one here. So we have x minus 5. We want to set that equal to 0. So we have x minus 5 equals 0. So x equals 5. So your two zeros in this case are going to be 0 and 5. Take a moment and pause the video and try these next two on your own. When you return to the video, the answers will be revealed below each. And there you have it. You may be wondering, what is the purpose behind this? What do these zeros mean? Well, if you take a moment and plug d into your calculator, for example, as in parenthesis x plus 4, close parenthesis, parenthesis x minus 3, and close that parenthesis, and then click graph. So you're going to put that into the y equals portion, and when you graph it, the two zeros where it crosses the x-axis, that's going to cross the x-axis at negative 4 and 3. So essentially, you're getting the same result as you did when you were graphing. However, you generally don't see a quadratic function written in this form. You generally see it written as a trinomial. So we will need to factor to make it look like the other problems we were just doing. Alright, so let's factor this first one. We have x squared plus 7x plus 10 equals 0. We want to set it equal to 0 so that way when we factor, we end up using the zero product property to find our zeros. So let's factor. We want two numbers that are going to multiply to give us 10, but when we add them together, they are going to give us a positive 7. Well, our two numbers, if we multiply 5 and 2 together, we get 10, and if we add them, we get 7. So we have 5 and 2. And now this looks exactly like what we were doing in the past 4 examples. So we want to use our zero product property. So what does x have to be to make this first part 0? Well, in this case, it's got to be negative 5. And in this second piece here, x has to equal negative 2. So our zeros are negative 5 and negative 2. Notice how in B, the c value is on the other side of the equation. When you're solving quadratic equations by factoring, you want to keep everything to the same side. So we're going to move this 8 to the left. So we have x squared plus 2x, and when we try to move any number from one side of the equation to the other, it switches its value, so it becomes negative 8 equals 0. And now we can factor this trinomial. So we have x, and then we want two numbers that are going to multiply to give us negative 8, but when we add them, give you 2. And in this case, it would be positive 4 and negative 2. Positive times a negative is a negative, and when you add 4 and negative 2, you get a positive 2. So now we have one more step. We need to find our zeros. So you'd have x is equal to negative 4 in this case, and in this one, x is equal to 2. So your two zeros are going to be negative 4 and 2. So now let's try factoring c. We've got x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals 0. Everything is already to one side of the equation, so we can simply jump right to factoring. So we want two numbers that are going to multiply to give us 1, but add to give us positive 2. So we start with our x's, and 1 times 1 is going to give us 1, but when we add 1 and 1 together, we get a positive 2. Notice how both of these are the same. If you were to get the 0 for this first one, you'd have x equals negative 1. And if you did the same thing to the second part, you'd still have x equals negative 1. So both factors result in the same solution, so there's only one solution. It's just negative 1. This means that the vertex of your parabola is touching the x-axis, because there's only one point where it crosses. Alright, so notice how we need to get all of our values to the same side of the equation. As a rule of thumb, we move everything to the side with the highest power. So we're going to have negative 2x squared plus 12x, because we're moving it to the other side, so it switches its sign, and then minus 18 equals 0. Well, notice how all of them are divisible by 2. So we can factor out a negative 2 to make this problem a little more simplistic. So if we factor out our greatest common factor of negative 2, we're left with x squared minus 6x plus 9. And now we can simply factor our trinomial right here. So we rewrite the negative 2 out in front, and now we're going to factor. We want two numbers that are going to multiply to give us 9, but add to give us negative 6. Well, if we multiply negative 3 and negative 3, we're going to end up with a positive 9, but if we add two negatives together, they're just going to become more negative, and that would be negative 6. So now we want to find our zeros. Notice how x minus 3 and x minus 3, they're the same, just like what happened over in problem C. That means that you're only going to have one zero. So x equals 3, and if you double check here, x still equals 3. So your 0 is simply 3. Take a moment and pause the video and try these next two on your own. When you return to the video, the answers will be revealed below both. And there you have it. Now take a moment and try these next two on your own. When you return to the video, the answer will be revealed below. And there you have it. Now that you've had a moment to look that over, factors of 9, you want 3 and 3. Factors of 25, you want 5 and 5. Your outside would be the two outside portions of that column. The inner would be the two inner portions of that column. And when you put them all together, you want to make sure it equals your b value. Your setup, your factors of 9 make up your first parts to both of your binomials. The factors of 25 are going to make up the second parts of both of your binomials. And then you simply follow the pattern that you've been doing. You set each piece equal to 0 and then solve for the variable. So 3x plus 5 equals 0, and therefore x is going to equal negative 5/3. And then you do the same exact thing for this one on the right. So step 1, factor. Step 2, find the zeros of each of your binomials, and then you're all set. Let's put this all together and do a sports application. The height of a diver above water during a dive can be modeled by h equals negative 16t squared plus 8t plus 48, where h is the height in feet and t is the time in seconds. Find the time it takes for the diver to reach the water. To do so, we can simply factor this quadratic function. So we're going to have 0 equals, because the height when she hits the water is going to be 0 feet above the water. And then we can factor our negative 16t squared plus 8t plus 48. Notice how each of these has the greatest common factor altogether of negative 8. So we're going to take out a negative 8. And when we factor that out, we're left with 2t squared minus t minus 6. And then we can simply factor this trinomial. When you factor the trinomial, you're going to end up with 0 equals negative 8, and then times the quantity 2t plus 3, and t minus 2. Alright, so then our 0 for this first piece here, you're going to say 2t plus 3 equals 0, and when we solve for t, we end up with t equals negative 3/2. And then when we solve for the second one here, we have t minus 2 equals 0, so t is going to equal 2. Well, when you're dealing with time, you can't have negative time. So therefore, this one right here does not work out. So it's going to take 2 seconds for her to hit the water. And this ends our video lesson on solving quadratic equations by factoring.